Hey, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Congregation Havas Achim. I'm Rabbi Dan Aronson. I'd like to welcome everyone here in this sanctuary, as well as our friends on Zoom this evening, to tonight's lecture with Dr. Sue Hampel, which is being presented by the Cohen Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Keene State College and the Nathan E. Cohen Lecture Series here at Havas Achim. In just a moment, the chair of our NEC Lecture Series, Randall Carmel, will introduce tonight's program. Before then, I want to thank Randy personally for his leadership as the immediate past president of the synagogue, for chairing the NEC Lecture Series, and for helping to bring Sue to CAA this evening. I also want to thank Jan and Rick Cohen and the Cohen Center for allowing us to host Sue and her husband Alex here this evening. I also want to give a shout out to Daniela Yitzchak, our office manager, who has provided some yummy treats for us at a reception following Sue's talk. There will be an opportunity for our in-house audience to ask Sue questions after her presentation. We'll have two microphones that right now are positioned here, but they will make their way into the audience at that time. We are also recording tonight's program, so if you have any friends who could not be here, that will be available on the synagogue website in a week or two. If you need an assistive listening device, they are available out in the foyer just to the left of the entrance where you just came in at the back of the sanctuary. One program note, please join us on Thursday night, December 14th at the Keene Family Y for our second annual Keene Community Hanukkah Menorah lighting. That will be at 5:30. And lastly, some housekeeping tips. In case of an emergency, we have two emergency exits here, and where you came in, as well as if you go out the back doors to the sanctuary and turn left, there is another exit there. If for any reason we need to evacuate the building, go as far from the building as you can, but don't get in your car and drive away because that would block emergency vehicles. We have non-gendered bathrooms off of the foyer here and at the bottom of the stairs, and men's and women's rooms right beneath the bima, the stage area here, that you can also access down in the basement. And last but not least, please turn off your cell phones or anything else that can go bump or ding in the night. It's now my pleasure to introduce Randall Carmel, who will introduce tonight's program. Randy?
So it's really my honor tonight in a couple of different ways. First, Dr. Arthur Cohen celebrating his 95th birthday, sort of honoring Sue with this lecture and combining those two. It's just, it's, I don't know, it comes together. It's beautiful for many reasons. But let's just take one moment, maybe 30 seconds, and just breathe. Think about the hostages. Think about the conflict. Parallel universes we're living in. We're here tonight. And there's just this conflict. And it's just hard not to mention. So let's just take a moment of silence. So over 25 years ago, Dr. Cohn, who I think most of you know now through the programming, turned 95. And he developed a lecture series in honor of his father, Nathan. And his intention was to integrate the Jewish community, our synagogue, with the local community, and just try to make it so that we weren't so separate. And so for 25 years, we've been holding lectures, as the one we are tonight. And they've helped us as a community come together. And so it's really special for me. You know, I've chaired this committee for many years. I think many of us have participated in this who are here. And so it is really special because, you know, Sue brings to us a purpose. Like, her work is relevant. And she's been doing it before it became as relevant and clear to us as it is tonight. For how many years has she been out in the community, out in the world, teaching about the importance, the relevance of Holocaust studies? She's been doing it. Thousands of kids she has brought to Israel, Poland. I don't know, so you can perhaps speak more about it. I mean, she's doing the work. These now are emissaries. All these individuals that she has worked with are out in the world communicating about their knowledge, their lessons that they've learned from Sue. So we have Arthur Cohn on one hand, and we have Sue on the other. And what a beautiful, honestly, melting of talent, both local, international, universal, probably. Sue, thank you for coming. It's like a big trip. It's not an easy one, right? So another quick story, and I don't want to take up too much time, but I'm in Crete at Hangna. It's like one of the largest, I think it's the largest city in Crete. And I'm doing some day hikes with Judy Rubin, who's here. And I just come back from 3 weeks in India. And we're in a courtyard in a little boutique hotel. And we meet this couple. They're older, like me. Like now I get it. And we're saying, oh, what did you guys do today? What are we going to do? And the idea, like, it came up that we were going to both visit a synagogue. Just because, like, the war had been 2 weeks, we wanted to show something. And we connected as Jews in the middle of, you know, Greece, and had no connection. Then I pulled out the card. Well, you know what? My synagogue is bringing in Sue Hampel. You guys are from Australia, right? You know Sue. They knew her. Their faces lit up. And they lit up with this story, that she had influenced so many kids, young kids in secondary school. It was beautiful. Their faces lit up. And again, I'm just going to say, that is probably one of the most powerful things for us as Jews to have. Now, the individuals, the students that Sue has taught, going out in the world and carrying the message of the lessons of the Holocaust. Sue, I know I sort of ignored some of your pedigree, which, okay. Anyway, please come up. Thank you.
put it there. Is that all right? You can hear me? I think that is the most beautiful introduction I have ever heard in my life. Randy, thank you. That was really beautiful. Thank you so much. And I'd like to thank Dr. Arthur Cohen, President Roy Ginsberg, Rabbi Dan Aronson, Randy, you for your beautiful words and for organising the lecture series. And I hear there is a staff person extraordinaire, Daniela Yitzhak. Yeah, thank you as well for everything that you've done on my behalf and for inviting me tonight. And I'd like to thank the amazing Jan and Rick Cohen for enabling this trip. Our friendship started in the land down under, Australia. About 5 years ago, Jan and I connected straight away. It was like we were kindred spirits. We shared a love of family, especially grandchildren, travel, Yiddishkeit, which means love and respect for our heritage, and education. We are both very passionate about learning from the past to create a better tomorrow. And thank you for our special friendship, Jan. Thank you to Dr. Kate de Koning, Director of the Cohen Centre for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, for facilitating the very, very busy schedule of events that I have been enjoying for the last few days. So, as I said last night at the college, the events that took place on Kristallnacht, we're going there, 85 years ago, marked a turning point in the history of the Holocaust. And as Jews, we are deeply aware of the echoes and reverberations of history. And as we look at the world today, where hate, discrimination, and anti-Semitism abound, we must ask ourselves the question, have we learned anything in the last 85 years? The Australian Jewish community, as all Jewish communities around the world, was devastated by Hamas's brutal attack on Israel on October the 7th, which resulted in the most lethal assault against the Jewish people since the Holocaust. In cities across the globe, anti-Semitic hate crimes are on the rise, and this has prompted Australian survivors to do something that they have never done before. Over 100 survivors made a collective statement on the front page of the Australian newspaper and spoke directly to the people of Australia. And here is part of what they said. Never did we think that we would witness a reenactment of the senseless and virulent hatred of Jews that we faced in Europe. The actions of Hamas are so barbaric, yet instead of condemning this, the response across the globe is a shameful spike in anti-Semitism. Our memories and our experiences in ghettos, concentration camps and hiding, seeing our families and communities vanish, compel us to raise our voices and implore humanity to reject hatred, bigotry, and violence. We cannot allow history to repeat itself. We ask all Australians to denounce the anti-Semitism and hatred that we see today in our beautiful country and across the globe. We ask you to stand with us. The powerful words of these Holocaust survivors have resonated across Australia. And thank you, yeah. And I found the outside, it's amazing what your synagogue has done outside. I found it very emotional, and I hope that the people who are kidnapped, the captives, come home soon. Okay, so can you all hear me properly? Sorry? Get rid of this? Okay, get rid of that. Oh, touch the screen. That's it? Yeah, and you can hear me properly? A little bit up, is that better? Yeah. Okay, so tonight's going to be a very different talk because you probably don't know much about what I'm going to be talking to you tonight. So I thought I'd talk about 4 things. The talk will be about 30 minutes, and then I'd love you to ask me any questions about this or about anything to do with Australia. I'm going to tell you about the dispossession of the Indigenous people in Australia, the story about the stolen generations, campaign for equal rights for Indigenous people, and then talk about the Jewish community and their role in supporting Aboriginal causes. So, a bit of a history lesson. When the British first arrived on the shores of Australia, the land was declared a terra nullius, nobody's land. But the island continent was actually home to hundreds of different Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nations and clans who immediately deemed subjects of the British Crown. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the dispossession of Australia's Indigenous people, the plight of the stolen generations, and discuss the developments that I just mentioned before. So the British colonists came in 1788. There were 11 ships. There were 1,400 people who established the first European settlements in New South Wales. Captain Arthur Phillip was the commander of the First Fleet, and on these ships were military leaders and sailors and 750 convicts who had come from Portsmouth, England, and that included British men and women whose crimes ranged from petty theft to assault. And convicts on these vessels were sent to 7 years transportation. This was the term for sending prisoners to far-off countries. Captain Phillip wasn't the first Englishman to come to Australia's shores. There was Captain Cook. I don't know if you remember any of his stories. 1770, Captain Cook. They didn't set up a camp. They stayed on board their ship and they fished and explored, and the Indigenous people didn't really want to interact with them. And Cook charted the Australian eastern coastline and claimed the entire country for King George III of Great Britain. Now, what is interesting is that the British government justified the settlement of Australia by calling it terra nullius, in other words, nobody's land, completely ignoring the fact that there was an Indigenous people on our land for 60,000 years. The British just basically marched in and took over. This map shows you the different Indigenous language groups that was there before the British came. Nobody knows the exact population of Australia in 1788, but it's estimated there might have been up to 750,000 people living in the land. And according to international law of Europe in the late 18th century, there were only 3 ways that Britain could take possession of another country. Either if the country was uninhabited, Britain could claim and settle the country and claim ownership of the land. But I just told you that wasn't the case. If the country was already inhabited, Britain could ask for permission from the Indigenous people to use some of their land. Well, in this case, Britain could purchase land, but it could not steal the land of the Indigenous people. Britain didn't know about that rule either. If the country was inhabited, Britain could take it over by invasion and conquest. In other words, defeat the country in war. But even after the winning the war, Britain should have respected the rights of the Indigenous people, and they didn't. The terra nullius, this idea that Australia was a no man's land, do you know when it was overturned? 1992. Okay? Took a long, long time. So, and I'm going to tell you about the native title and the fights for all of that. So, prior to the arrival of the First Fleet, they were the only humans, the Indigenous people, to live in Australia. There were many, many different nations, each with their own language or dialect, laws, beliefs and traditions. And as I told you, for 60,000 years, they lived in Australia as hunter-gatherers. The men were the hunters, the women were the gatherers. Surprise, surprise. With no signs of land ownership like fences or crops or stock animals or buildings, the British who arrived on the First Fleet believed the land was free to claim. Almost immediately, they cleared the land for farming and started building towns. The settlers fenced off land, often near sacred sites to the Indigenous people, and the fences cut access to clean water, hunting grounds and food supplies for the Indigenous communities. And as British settlement expanded, more Indigenous groups were forced off their lands. The Indigenous people struggled to survive, and many died from starvation and malnourishment. And between 1788 and 1900, 90% of the Indigenous population was reduced because they were forced out of their homes. They were exposed to new diseases brought by the Westerners like smallpox, tuberculosis, and they were killed in conflicts with the colonial powers. So in summary, the arrival of the First Fleet changed the lives of Australia's first people forever. It was violent conflict, displacement, exile and disease. And the colonialists destroyed within months a way of life that had outlasted British history by tens of thousands of years. And to most settlers, the Aboriginal people were like the kangaroos or the dingoes or the emus or the fauna that had to be eradicated to make way for the development of farming and grazing. Because the British saw the Aborigines as primitive people with a primitive mentality and signed no treaty. There is still today no treaty at all with our Indigenous people. And I thought it might be interesting to have I don't know much about America. I've been reading a little bit about America and treaties, but this is New Zealand, right? And Canada, the United States, New Zealand have all entered into treaties with the British. But and the United States, I did read, between 1778 and 1871, signed 500 treaties with American Indian nations. I think they broke a lot of those treaties, but at least they signed them. And then I also read that the US House of Representatives in 1871 stopped recognising individual tribes as independent nations, putting an end to the treaty-making era. And as we said, most treaties were broken. But in this photo, which is interesting, you can see a Maori, this is from the New Zealand Indigenous people, leader signing a treaty in front of various British officials and witnesses. That was in 1840. The Treaty of Waitangi was signed between 540 Maori chiefs and the British Crown. And it's still today one of the foundational documents for the nation of New Zealand and is celebrated every year with a public holiday. The issue with the treaty is that the translation in English and Maori was very, very different. So the English version said the Maori were agreeing to hand over sovereignty to the British, and the Maori version was sovereignty means governance. So in other words, the Maori said they'd allow British to set up a government, but they would retain sovereignty and maintain their rights. And they're also pretty much a warrior nation. And so they sort of made sure that the treaty was enforced. So the Indigenous people were treated really, really badly. And this is Rottnest Island off the coast of Perth in Western Australia. And this island received first prisoners in 1838 and it became a prison. And maybe 4,000 Aboriginal men and boys were incarcerated on the island. And you can see that they're taken there in chains. Many were transported over long distances in the heat of northern summers and across cold and windy oceans, and the prison was cramped and cold, and 5 prisoners up in a 2-metre cell, which meant that men would have a sleeping width of less than 60 centimetres, a very, very high mortality rate. This is the second dispossession of the Indigenous land. So there wasn't one policy across Australia when it came to dealing with the Indigenous people, because Australia was divided into different states. So there wasn't a federal policy, there were state policies which varied. So this is from Victoria, where I thought you might be interested where I come from. The Victorian government decided that they would reserve land for Aboriginal people, and the government set up a board for the protection of Aborigines, which had power over where the Aboriginal people could work and live. And they were put in 6 government mission stations or reservations. And this is Corranderk, which is Healesville today. If you've been to Melbourne, you might remember. It's a beautiful, there's like native park with kangaroos and koalas there. In the beginning, Corranderk was productive and profitable, and there was autonomy for the Kulin Nation people in developing the land. And it was a popular tourist destination because the Indigenous people sold baskets, bags, boomerangs, and skin rugs. But what happens over time is that people who were moving to Victoria wanted more land. And the managers over this reservation, the Australian managers, were strict and controlling. And these residents rebelled. They wrote petitions and fought against efforts to control their lives. But the problem was that they kept reducing the land size of Corranderk. And the Victorian government passed a Half-Caste Act, or the Aboriginal Protection Law Amendment Act, which said any Aboriginal people with European ancestry aged between 15 and 35 have to leave the reserve to be absorbed in the general white community. So this population was halved and families were split in half. And these photos are a couple of interesting things. It talks to the idea that the British, at first they expected most of the Indigenous people to be killed off, and those who weren't would have to be assimilated. And I think this is a good picture that shows you this idea of civilising the natives, you know, making sure that they were assimilated. So the second part of the story relates to the stolen generations, and this is a very, very sad story, because there was a white Australia policy in Australia, and the dominant perception, as I told you, was that the Aboriginal people would die out. And that was the idea of social Darwinism, that only fittest would survive. And since colonisation, numerous government laws and practices and policies resulted in the forced removal of generations of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families and communities across Australia. Thousands of children were taken, actually up to 50,000 they think, by governments, by churches, by welfare bodies, to be raised in institutions or fostered out or adopted by non-Indigenous families nationally and internationally. And they are called the stolen generation. And as I've got on the slide here, 10 to 30% of Indigenous children were taken, and that's approximately 50,000 children. It's not just the numbers though, the numbers don't mean anything, but think about the devastating impact this would have had on people's families and communities. The exact number we don't know, but every single family that I know would know somebody who was taken as a member of the stolen generation. And taking the children away broke important cultural, spiritual and family lives that has led to lasting intergenerational trauma. And Kevin Gilbert, an Australian historian, said Aboriginal Australia underwent a rape of the soul so profound that the blight continues in the minds of most blacks today. It is this psychological blight more than anything else that causes the conditions we see on our reservations and on our missions. So this photo is an interesting one. Children were classified according to their caste. They could be a half caste or a quadroon, quarter caste, or an octoroon, an eighth caste. And if you have a look here, so this is an interesting one because in Alice Springs, children were removed from their home, but they didn't actually have anywhere where they were going to put them. So that's a tin shed that these children had to live in. And next to the tin shed was a pub, a bar. Like, what's the point of taking them away from their families and then putting them in a tin shed? And this photo as well, you probably can't see it, but this is a group of half-caste and quadroon children. And this is an ad placed in the newspaper. Homes are sought for these children. And somebody had cut the ad out and wrote back to the home and said, I like the girl in the centre, can you see where the cross is? But if taken by anyone else, any of the others will do as long as they're strong. So children were removed because the authorities said it was in the best interest of the children. But once they were removed, there was very little provision. And so they were offered to be fostered out. So you can see here. And this photo is also very interesting. You can see the Governor-General inspecting these orphanages. These children are pretty well dressed and clothed, but you can see the Indigenous children. So they've been taken away from their families to be handed over to others to be brought up white, to be assimilated. This is Cootamundra Girls' Home. It was fundamental to the process of removing Aboriginal girls, and they were here, but they were trained to be domestic servants or farmhands in wealthy non-Aboriginal households. Parents had no access to these children until they were 18. So many of them never again. And the girls experienced systemic racial discrimination because they were told to remove all identity relating to their Aboriginality, and they were alienated from their families. This home was unique. It's the only government-run home for Aboriginal girls designed to train them for domestic service. And it's got a big place when we talk about the history of the stolen generations. And boys, by the way, were taken away and trained as agricultural workers. So in summary, if you have a look here at this map, it shows the number of institutions, missions and reserves that are known to have housed the stolen generation children. So you can see all the different numbers on that map here. So that's sort of, and I'm giving you only a really quick glimpse into it because I want to encourage discussion if you're interested. So there is a very much a long, between 1940 and 1975, a really long campaign for Indigenous rights in Australia and very slow dismantling of discrimination against the Aboriginal people. So I'm going to briefly talk about four or five of these things. The freedom rides, which you'll find interesting, there's a connection to America, one referendum, the Native Title Act, an apology, and the referendum that we had last month in Australia as well. So this might look familiar. This is the Freedom Ride, okay? So in 1965, a group of students from the University of Sydney drew national and international attention to the appalling living conditions of Aboriginal people and racism that was rife in New South Wales country towns. Now, spurred on by their counterparts in the United States, and inspired by Martin Luther King, these students formed a Student Action for Aborigines, or SAFA. Their mission was to shine a light on the marginalisation of the Aboriginal people. They would directly challenge local laws. For example, Indigenous children weren't allowed to be in any of the public swimming pools, so they would highlight these laws. Led to lots of media coverage, it led to a lot of public debates about racism in Australia, and the 15-day bus journey known as the Freedom Ride became a defining moment in Australian activism. It was passive, it was non-violent action. The Constitution of Australia came into effect in 1901. Okay, we became a federation in 1901 and established Australia as a federation under the British monarchy. And when the Constitution was first written, only two sections, Section 51 and 127, referred to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And it basically said the Commonwealth could not make laws concerning Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and Aborigines were not to be counted in any Australian census. Sheep were counted in the census, but not Aboriginal people. In 1962, the Aboriginals were allowed to vote, but they were not allowed to be counted in the census. In other words, it meant Aborigines were not recognised as part of the Australian population, and the states, the different states, were in charge of policy making. And here's a quote from an Indigenous man: "Blackfellas jokingly say, we weren't considered people, so we must be part of the flora and fauna, but that's not even true. The fact is, we didn't exist at all." The petition called for changes to Section 51, so Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people could be counted in the official figures collected in the census and recognised as part of the Australian population. And the petition called for changes to Section 127, which would place responsibility for policy and laws with the federal government. So there would be one law defining everybody. And that meant states couldn't create individual laws, and the federal government would do that. So on May the 27th, 1967, the Australians voted to change the Constitution. 90.77% said yes in every single state and every single territory. So it was one of the most successful national campaigns in Australia's history. This is an interesting story. It's a little bit blurry here, but this is Eddie Mabo and the Native Title Land Rights Act. He was a merry man, and he grew up in the Torres Strait Islands. In 1959, he moved to Queensland. He was working on pearling vessels and as a labourer, and he became involved in community and political organisations like the referendum campaign that I just told you about of 1967. So in 1973, Eddie Mabo founded a black community school in Townsville, created to educate Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and preserve traditional knowledge and practices. Now, Eddie Mabo brought a case forward against the Queensland government when he discovered that his family, where they'd been living for years, did not actually own the land. And it was called the Mabo versus Queensland case. And what happened is that the Queensland government decided to very, very quickly pass an act which basically asserted that upon being annexed by the Queensland government in 1879, all of the land was vested in the Crown, free from any other rights, interests and claims. So they quickly did that so that the Indigenous people couldn't claim anything. And that was a court case, a really big High Court case. The result was here. The High Court actually said it was invalid. There was a challenge to the High Court case. But by 1992, it took a long, long time, nearly 20 years, the Australian High Court ruled in favour of limited native title. That overturned the idea of terra nullius. Remember, I told you 1992, it took until then, which held that Australia didn't belong to anyone before the European colonisation. And Paul Keating's government gave effect to the Mabo decision and introduced the Native Title Act, which facilitated the process of recognising native title. The Act overturned the idea that settlement in Australia extinguished Aboriginal rights. The High Court ruled that Aboriginal land should have been sold to the British. Mabo died of cancer before the case was resolved in 1991, but his legacy certainly lives on. And there was another native titles case called the Wick case not long after. And both of these things finally showed the long connection to the land. So what about the government? What's the government doing and the government approach to this? So this is Paul Keating. His speech in 1992, so we're talking about native title period, was the first true acknowledgement of colonialisation's damage by the Commonwealth Government. Delivered in 1993, the International Year of the Indigenous People, this speech saw Paul Keating directly address the Indigenous community and take moral responsibility for the atrocities of colonisation for the first time. Keating's choice of location was significant. He did it in Redfern, which was the centre of Aboriginal or Koori culture and activism in Sydney for decades. The speech has remained a touchstone of the reconciliation journey and laid the groundwork for other acknowledgement of historical wrongs. So that was Paul Keating. I mean, we don't have time to do, I don't think, to show you any of the clips. No, probably. We'll see. Maybe if we've got time, I can show you one speech later, an extract. This is John Howard. He came after Paul Keating. He has a very, very different approach. He talks about the black armband view of history. So this is like the history wars. Like a lot of countries have history wars about what's the real history, what's not. And is it a black armband or is it a white blindfold? So during the 1980s, there was this contest when it was the 200th anniversary of white settlement. And Conservatives said that the bicentenary was challenging the nation's British origins and promoting a patronising, noble savage mystique of the Australian Aboriginal, which caters to white guilt and black vengeance. And as these charges took hold, the government removed all contentious elements from the bicentennial program, because what they're saying is that they didn't like the fact that now Australia was saying, well, you know, we should have done this for the Indigenous people, we should have done that. It's sort of like the black history approach. So John Howard said the black armband view of our past reflects a belief that most Australian history since 1788 has been little more than a disgraceful story of imperialism, exploitation, racism, sexism, and other forms of discrimination. I take a very different view. I believe the balance sheet of our history is one of heroic achievement, and we have achieved much more as a nation of which we can be proud and of which we should be ashamed. In saying that, I do not exclude specific aspects of our past where we are rightly held to account. Injustices were done in Australia, and no one should obscure or minimise them. But if you read between the lines, what's he saying? Yeah, exactly. So he's saying, like, stop it, you know, with the negative. We did what we could. We civilised these people. So he wasn't very popular, as you can imagine. And this is a bit long, and I apologise, but it's interesting. Kevin Rudd was the Prime Minister who actually did a proper apology, and he today is Australia's ambassador to the United States. So he's living in Washington. He just moved into, apparently there's a new Australian embassy that opened a couple of weeks ago. But this was the most amazing speech ever. It was in February. He came, he was voted into power. He defeated John Howard and was voted into power. And this was in February 2008. And I really remember I was sitting in the car and I'd never heard anything like this before. This is part of what he said. We reflect and now this is an apology to the stolen generations, not for everything, it's just to the children that I told you about. We reflect in particular on the mistreatment of those who are stolen generations, this blemished chapter in our nation's history. The time has now come for the nation to turn a new page in Australia's history by righting the wrongs of the past and so moving forward with confidence to the future. We apologise for the laws and policies of successive parliaments and governments that have inflicted profound grief, suffering and loss on our fellow Australians. We apologise especially for the removal of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families, communities and their country, to the mothers and the fathers, the brothers and the sisters, for the breaking up of families and communities. We are sorry. From a nation's parliament, there has been a stony, stubborn and deafening silence for more than a decade. He was referring to John Howard, of course. There comes a time in history, in the history of nations, when their peoples must become fully reconciled to their past, if they are to go forward with confidence and embrace their future. It is time to reconcile. It is time to recognise the injustices of the past. It is time to say sorry. It is time to move forward together. To the stolen generations, I say the following. As Prime Minister of Australia, I am sorry. I offer you this apology without qualification. So that was like the front page. There's Kevin Rudd, and that was on the front page. It was really, really special and a really emotional. And just think about that, you know, like over 200 years where the Indigenous people had to endure such terrible things. What is interesting, though, if you listen to that speech, it was good, but there's a few things missing in that speech. It was very heartfelt and very warming, and I felt very proud to be an Australian that day. But one of the Indigenous people said, when Rudd said sorry, that was fantastic. We thought everything was going to go, but that went nowhere. It was only words. There were no actions coming after that. Our people are still not free. Our people are still dying young. It's heartrending for some of our old Indigenous elders that have come from the hardness of colonisation. So yes, the apology was good, and yes, it was emotional and very meaningful, but whether it did result in a lot of change still remains to be seen. But I think the fact that this apology happened and that we start to hear the stories, and there are websites about all of this, thank you, that I think that, you know, I think it makes a really, really big difference. And I didn't tell you, Randy, that I actually, because I really believe in all of this, that I, at Monash University, where I teach Holocaust and Genocide Studies, I actually taught the Arab-Israel conflict semester 1. That was really interesting. That was before everything, of course, happened. But I am an academic mentor to Indigenous students, because at our university we have lots of places for Indigenous students, and to make sure that, you know, they don't fall, like that they're sort of well looked after and everything. So I'm one of the academic mentors, which I'm very proud of. So what happens moving right along? This is called the Uluru Statement from 2017. It was an invitation from a group of First Nations people to non-Indigenous Australians, calling for reform to help realise Indigenous rights through the establishment of an Indigenous voice to Parliament and a Makarrata or Truth-Telling Commission. And the 3 pillars said in this Uluru Statement was there should be a voice enshrined to provide expert advice to Parliament about laws and policies that affect Indigenous people. There should be a treaty, because remember I told you no treaty, agreement making between governments and First Nations people that acknowledge the rights and interests of the First People by formally recognising sovereignty, the land that was never ceded, and there should be truth to enable how Australia can understand its colonial history. So this was a really good idea. Everybody thought it was wonderful, and I'll tell you what happened to that in a few minutes. So Jewish people have always been involved and active in the, you know, standing up for Indigenous people. So I did a little bit of stint doing, I'll tell you about that in a second. The guy here is Ron Caston, okay, and he was amazing. So he left an enormous legacy when it comes to human rights and Indigenous rights. And he was the one who was the leading lawyer in the landmark Mabo case that I told you about before, Eddie Mabo native title case, which reversed the concept of terra nullius and secured land rights for Indigenous people. And he had been 10 years working on that case. And it can be confidently said, this is what people talk about with Ron Caston, that without the different and vital contributions of Eddie Mabo and Ron Caston, the Mabo case would never have survived a 10-year tortuous course, let alone succeed. And in 1971, he was the founding secretary of the Victorian Aboriginal Legal Service. He appeared before the High Court, but unfortunately he passed away quite young. Actually, he was not even 60 years old when he passed away. This is also another photo. So on the right is Mark Liebler. It's very, very much the Liebler family involved in Jewish affairs. He runs a big law firm called Arnold Bloch Liebler and do a lot of work. He's here with Indigenous leaders Noel Pearson, Professor Marsha Langton and Pat Dodson, and he played a national role in the pursuit of appropriate recognition of Australia's First People for more than a decade. He was a co-chair on the expert panel of constitutional recognition, and he and his law firm actively advocated for recognition, and one of the few non-Indigenous people invited to that amazing ceremony in Uluru, where that statement of the heart, that picture that I showed you just before, was read. He's an amazing advocate and an amazing person. And I'm doing this quickly because we're running out of time. I thought this painting was really interesting. So we've just opened our Holocaust Museum. We've been renovating for 4 years. Actually, it's being open next week. I'm not there for the opening because I'm here. But we have this painting in our library. And this is a beautiful story. It's called Coming Together. It was painted in 2017. Viv Parry, an artist and an educator, was the head of our Australian Holocaust survivor child survivor group. And she taught this Indigenous man how to paint. And he painted this as a gift to Viv because she taught him how to paint, and he launched a career for him in art. And he said, my thought for this painting is to show half the painting representing the Aboriginal people in dots of red, yellow and black, and the other half to represent the Jewish people using the blue and white of the Israeli flag. The traditional signs for journey and meeting appear on each side. You can see the Aboriginal people's journey to the Jewish people and the Jewish people's journey to the Aboriginal people's land. The star in the centre is the meeting place where both cultures come together as one shared community. So I thought that was really beautiful. And last night I talked about William Cooper. This story is just amazing. So in 1938, after Kristallnacht, William Cooper is an Indigenous elder, and he is waiting for, he's like in 77 or something, and he's waiting for protests across the world about Kristallnacht. And to his surprise, there's very little protests. So he actually decides it's not good enough. So he organises a petition and organises a whole lot of Aboriginal people in 1938, remember, no rights, no nothing, flora, fauna, that sort of thing. And they go to the German consulate to hand a petition saying, you can't treat people like this. How can you treat Jewish people like this? And he says, on behalf of the Aboriginal inhabitants, we want it registered and on record. We protest wholeheartedly at the cruel persecution of the Jewish people by the Nazi government in Germany. We plead you make it known to your government and its military leaders this cruel persecution of their fellow citizens must be brought to an end. Isn't that amazing, in 1938, that William Cooper did that? So the Indigenous Centre where I work as academic mentor is now named the William Cooper Indigenous Centre. It was pretty amazing. So the last thing I want to talk about really quickly, and we can talk about it more in the questions, is so we had a referendum last month, and the law was going to be to alter the Constitution, Australia's Constitution, to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Now that means that basically recognising Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people in the Constitution, paying respect to the 60,000 years of culture, listening to advice from their people about matters that affect their lives, let them decide. And I didn't tell you, by the way, the Indigenous people are less than 3% of the total population of Australia. A very, very, very small percentage. And because they can't make their voice be heard, that's why this referendum was important, that Australians could give them the voice so that they could be in charge of their own affairs. And it was about practical issues as well. The idea came from the Indigenous people, but the No campaign, it was very unclear, the referendum. It wasn't sort of explained properly, and our Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, had just been elected into Parliament, and he said he was going to make it happen, but to me there wasn't enough explanation about it. And then the No vote was saying, if you don't know, vote no. Like if you don't know, I mean, to me it would say if you don't know, read about it and find out about it. We hosted events at our Holocaust Museum to explain why people should vote yes, but unfortunately the referendum didn't pass. So this is just now, like a couple of weeks ago. 60% overall voted no. You had to have a majority in each state, but you can see the blue is the yes, and unfortunately in all the states, Victoria was the highest, you can see, but it was only 45% said no. So the long campaign for Indigenous rights in Australia still has more and more and more steps to go. And then the last thing I want to tell you, it's interesting, there's a whole movement now. 26th of January is when the first fleet, remember we talked about before, came, and people don't like that's Australia's public holiday, it's Australia Day, and people are saying that it should be called Invasion Day because that's actually what happened. And I was talking to Jan and she told me to have a look at Columbus Day because you've got a similar situation here. Like, it's the same thing, right? Is it Columbus Day or is it Indigenous Peoples Day? So, yeah. So, I've sort of taken you on a really quick journey of Australian history over the past couple of 100 years, and hopefully when I see you again one day, that road won't be as long and the Indigenous people will be recognised properly. So thank you. Thank you.
So I just wanted to, Sue, like, one of my expertise is child welfare in the United States, and we have what's called the Indian Child Welfare Act. I don't know if you're familiar with
No.
that. So it's similar to some of the things that you were talking about. It's legislation that was passed in the 70s that tried to prevent placing white values on Indian culture. So we were removing children from reservations and putting them in different households or placing them in foster care because they weren't sort of meeting our standards or the white standards. And so the legislation's been powerful. I don't know if you have any legislation in Australia that's
So now
similar?
it's not done. Now so once we did the stolen generations and recognised it, and the apology doesn't happen anymore.
So is there tribal courts that deal with issues?
In some of the states,
In
yes.
some of the states. Okay, so
Yeah.
go on.
Yeah. Any questions about that, or about the work that I do in Australia, or about Australian rules football? Probably not. No. Jan.
Close down the screen
Yeah.
sharing.
Thanks for the very informational presentation, Sue.
Go back.
What's the likelihood of the referendum coming up again anytime soon?
Yeah, it's not. I don't think it's going to come back again. The Labor Prime Minister, who's there at the moment, said that's it. We put it to rest. We're going to look at different ways of maybe, have other truth-telling commissions or something, but it probably won't come back again. I mean, the opposition said that they're going to have another referendum, but I don't know if there's no point having a referendum unless there's bipartisan support. In all the referendums that we've had in Australia, only the ones with bipartisan support. Yeah, interesting, we had a referendum about whether or not to become a republic, but in 1999, but 55% of Australians voted no. They wanted to still, be part of the Commonwealth. So that might be a referendum that will come up in the next 10 or so years, maybe. Good question, thank you.
My wife and I, can you hear me? Yeah, went to New Zealand and Australia for several weeks each back in 2006, which was a long time ago. I recall the year because the Commonwealth Games were at play in Melbourne with all the illuminated fountain fish in the middle of the river, and explained why we couldn't get good lodgings in Melbourne, unlike the other places. But we were in New Zealand, and we can attest to the fact that the Maori, though not really obviously of equal status with whites, are much more empowered than the Aboriginal peoples that we saw in Australia. And in fact, they're guaranteed seats in the parliament.
Yes.
By the Treaty of Waitangi. We saw Aboriginal people from North Queensland down through New South Wales, and we're in Melbourne. We went out to Kangaroo Island, and I saw, to my great delight, the ferry boat, I think it's called the Queen of Tasmania, or whatever, heading south towards Tasmania. It just made me wonder whether, if my memory is not mistaken, terrible things happened in Tasmania. Is that not right?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I did want to tell you there are Indigenous people in our parliament. I think there's been about 9 or so altogether. So there are Indigenous people represented. But Tasmania has a terrible history. So have you heard of Raphael Lemkin? Raphael Lemkin's the guy who coined the term genocide. He was looking for a word that would describe what was happening to Jews during what became known as the Holocaust. And when he did his study about genocide, he actually quoted 2 examples, and one was what happened to the Indigenous people in Tasmania, because there they were really not treated very well at all. And in the end, I think there was just one old woman left from the whole tribe from the people who were taken there. So you're right about that. Yeah. Maoris are about 20%, close to 20%, I think, of the New Zealand population, where our Indigenous people are only about 3%. Yeah, thank you for that.
Hi, I just had a quick question. So I was really hopeful when the voice referendum came up. And then I began to hear a lot of like testimonies from Australian people, and a lot of what I was hearing was this idea of like, it's done, it's happened, we need to move on. So I was wondering what you think is next when it comes to education, because I feel like a lot of what was being portrayed was this idea of feel of what that would mean for the everyday Australian person. And like you said, I think a lot of it was if you don't know, vote no, but there was also that, in my opinion, misguided feel that this would mean something bad for the typical Australian person. So in your opinion, what's next? How does education play a part in this next step?
Yeah, that's a really, really, really good question. And by the way, because remember I told you they're not homogenous, the Indigenous people. There are a whole lot of the monolithic, not at all. There are a whole lot of different groups and different tribes, and only about 80% of the Indigenous people wanted the voice as well. So what I think is going to happen is I was very upset the next morning when I woke up, and I'm not that I was surprised, because all the opinion polls were saying that it would be defeated. And I think that they're just going to change the way that we look at it, and we're going to have a look at more, because some states already have these truth-telling commissions, so they're going to make other ways in order to hear the story properly. And some states have already been working in that field already. So, you know, the whole nation voted against the referendum, but I think that there'll be, you know, other measures that will be taken place to make Indigenous people feel okay and comfortable about it. It was really sad the next day. No, thank you for the question.
So here it seems more and more people are seeking Indigenous wisdom as a means of helping us survive the effects of climate change and the vilification of our waters and lands. Is that happening where you are as well?
So that's really, really interesting, because when the British came and colonised, they just came up with new rules, new laws, new everything. And now we have a lot of bushfires in Australia, and now they're saying maybe we should be listening actually to the Indigenous people who have lived on this continent for a very long time, because we are a land of drought and fire, and maybe that there is knowledge that can be gained from listening. But a lot of it has been because they didn't write down a lot. You know, it's like very spiritual, it's in the stars. But there is this movement to maybe ask Indigenous people if they have been passed down information about, you know, all of these issues that we're having. So that's interesting. So is it happening, you're saying, as well here? Yeah, we should have listened, shouldn't we, to the people who, yeah, exactly.
Okay, we're starting to tie up, but we'll take a couple more questions, okay? Aaron?
Thank you for a very good lecture, very informative. I have a couple of questions. One, did Australia ever have slavery?
No. Did we? No.
Second question, maybe it hasn't been done yet, but I noticed there were large differences. For example, I think Queensland was at 66% of the people voted against it. Some of the other provinces, much less. Has anybody done a correlation between educational levels and poverty, white poverty levels in the various provinces, and the degree of negativity on the vote?
So the interesting thing is that I haven't looked properly at the statistics. I've got them here, but that's where a lot of the Indigenous people, there's only 3%, I told you, but a lot of them would live in the Northern Queensland area, in the Northern Territory area. So maybe that's one of the reasons. I think it's a bit too soon to do the correlation, but that is very interesting, actually, to see if there is. I think the problem was more that people didn't understand, and that the No campaign was basically saying how the Indigenous people owned all the land here. They're going to come to your house and they're going to say that we have to take this back because now belongs to us, because now we have a voice. So I don't think it was explained properly. So to me, it was not that they didn't want to give the Indigenous people the rights. It was that they didn't really understand. All it was an advisory board, an advisory council. So Indigenous people could speak about their own affairs and present it to the Parliament. But nothing would happen without the government makes the decision about it, but they would have a voice to the Parliament. That's interesting how, the voting patterns. Yeah. Hello.
As I was driving today, I was listening to PBS out of Boston, and what they were discussing was MIT and Harvard and Cambridge, and that the land belonged to the native populations. And there is discussion about what do they do now. They're actually in the process in Cambridge of renaming streets to indigenous names, but there was even a discussion of giving the land back to the state of Massachusetts, and then the institutions, which now run very much close to each other instead of far apart back when we were there in the 60s, having leased the property from the state and to the indigenous groups. Is something like that happening at university levels in Australia?
No, but the lands like Melbourne is called Naarm. Like they're sort of giving Indigenous names to different parts of Australia, but I don't think Alex, no, it's nothing like that happening. I think it's because they're just such a small minority, like of the population, but there's certainly recognition and changing the names to the Indigenous, the original names. Like the Yarra River is got a different name, the main river that bifurcates the city in Melbourne. It's interesting. Yeah, Uluru. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, because you went there. That's right, Uluru. The Uluru statement that I showed you before, that was Ayers Rock. So we're changing names. So that's, I know, a good start. I'm not sure about the land, though. There's one more question.
So I was, two questions. One is, does Australia have a problem with homelessness or unhoused people? And if so, are the Aboriginals are they overrepresented in some ways in terms of the impoverishment or lack of housing or alcoholism or, various issues that would, of course, be as a result of trauma and displacement?
So Melbourne and Sydney, there aren't a lot of people. There are homeless, but I don't think they're Indigenous. But up north, I don't know, can you answer that question?
Aboriginals are very, very overrepresented in areas of incarceration, alcoholism, family disputes. Certainly, they die a lot younger than the white population. They're not as, their illnesses are a lot greater. The fact is that we as a population do not understand any sort of. We don't get it, we never did, and we haven't dealt with them properly.
And this is mainly in the Northern Territory, so where a lot of them live in the Northern Territory. So I've sort of rushed over a lot of the things that the Australian government has done in different ways to try and improve their lives, but that's why they wanted a voice, so that they would have more of a say, in it. Yeah, but good question, thank you. I mean, I've only given you like a potted summary, and I did want to tell you that the Australian Jewish community is an amazing community. We've got about 120,000 Jews, less than 0.5% of the population, but we punch above our weight. We're really like strong out there.
Well, Sue, just want to echo again, my appreciation for you coming here and just really informative, really interesting presentation.
Thank you.
And also, again, like your work. No, I know, but it's so important today. Like all those emissaries that are out there because of you.
Thank you.
Speaking the word.
Thank you very
Anyway,
much.
thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
And please take a couple of minutes and join us in a reception.
Excellent. I look forward to talking to you over there. Thank you.